Her husband sent her a text on New Year's Eve that said, "Stay home. You always ruin things." She read it once. She put the phone face down on the seat beside her, and she told the driver to keep going. What Rodrigo Solis did not know, what he could not have known, because he had never once thought to ask, was that the rideshare carrying his wife was already stopped outside the Aurelian Hotel, all 42 floors of it. The same building where, at that precise moment, 300 of his clients, his partners, and his colleagues were drinking his champagne and applauding his ambition in a ballroom that his wife's grandmother had built from the ground up in 1971. A building that, as of 3 days earlier, belonged entirely to Renata. Not to Rodrigo, not to the firm. To her. She sat in that car in a black gown her grandmother once wore to a board dinner, a stress fracture in her left foot, an estate document in her lap, and the sound of the New Year's Eve orchestra drifting down from 39 floors above her. And she did not go home. Upstairs, his mother Beatriz was working the room in her careful, expensive way. Somewhere in that crowd, Catalina Reyes, his project director, his other life, was standing close enough to adjust his tie. And Rodrigo was at the podium, announcing the project that was supposed to define his legacy, built, without his knowledge, on his wife's foundation. This isn't just a story about a woman who was told to stay home. It's about what happens when a man spends 17 years underestimating the very ground beneath his feet. If you're watching this, and you know what it feels like to be the most invisible person in your own life, this one's for you. Drop a like, subscribe if you're new, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. Now, to understand what Rodrigo found in that conference room on January 7th, we need to go back to where this really began. The side entrance of the Aurelian Hotel had a single brass handle, worn smooth at the center from 30 years of use. Renata gripped it with her free hand, her crutch braced against the pavement, and pulled. The door opened without resistance, as if it had been expecting her. The lobby was quieter than the street. Marble floors the color of pale sand, a ceiling that rose 4 stories above the check-in desk, and somewhere deep in the building's upper registers, the faint orchestral pulse of a party Renata had been told not to attend. She stood for a moment just inside the entrance and let the warmth settle around her. Her foot throbbed steadily inside its structured boot. She ignored it the way she had learned to ignore most things that asked for her attention at inconvenient times. Hector Funes was crossing the lobby before she had taken 3 steps. He was a compact man with the unhurried bearing of someone who had managed enough genuine crises that a social one no longer altered his pace. He had worked for Magdalena Solis for 11 years. He had attended her funeral 4 months ago, standing at the back in a dark suit, and he had shaken Renata's hand afterward with both of his and said nothing, because nothing was the right thing to say. When Sofia Reyes Banco's notice arrived that morning, formal letterhead, copied to the city permitting office, 2 paragraphs identifying Renata Elena Solis as the Aurelian's new owner of record. Hector had read it once, set it on his desk, and made 2 phone calls. One to his operations manager, one to the kitchen to confirm the lobby service cart would be staffed past midnight. He had not called upstairs. That was not his role. Ms. Solis. He did not say welcome. He did not say Happy New Year. He extended his hand and she shook it, and the steadiness of his grip told her what she needed to know. That this building knew her, that it had been waiting, that she was not a surprise to anyone here, except the 300 people celebrating 39 floors above her head. They sat at a corner table near the east window, away from the main desk. Hector produced a leather portfolio, the operational calendar, the outstanding lease summary, a flagged copy of the Land Use Covenant with Sophia's yellow highlighting still vivid across Clause 7, subsection C. Renata read it in the way she used to read planning documents at Meridian Urban Partners, her finger moving along each line without hurry, her expression neutral and focused. She had spent 17 years being told, in various registers, that she was not a professional. Her hands remembered otherwise. She asked 2 questions. Hector answered both in full sentences. She signed nothing. "Water, please," she said. Still. He nodded and was gone. The orchestra filtered down from the ballroom in waves. Strings first, then the low confidence of brass, then the compressed sound of 300 people talking at once. The Aurelian's walls were thick but not silent. Renata sat with her water glass and her folder, and her foot elevated slightly on the chair across from her, and she listened to the party the way you listen to weather, with attention, without feeling the need to go outside. Then his voice came through. Amplified, smoothed by a good microphone and the particular performance register Rodrigo used when a room needed managing. She could not make out the words at first, only the cadence, the rise and fall of a man who had learned to hold an audience the way he held a drafting pencil, with practiced confidence. Then the acoustics shifted, some trick of the building's bones, and 3 sentences descended through the floor and the chandeliers and the marble, and landed in the lobby with full clarity. The Cerro Blanco Cultural Center, the future of San Cristobal's skyline, the project that would define the next decade of the firm. Applause, real and sustained and warm. Renata took a sip of water. She set the glass down precisely in the center of its coaster. She did not look up at the ceiling. She did not need to. She thought about Clause 7, subsection C. She thought about the yellow highlighting. She thought about Magdalena, who had built this building from the ground up in 1971 and never once put her name on the front of it, who had hosted her own celebrations quietly, in rooms no one photographed, with people who already knew what she was worth. The estate document sat in her bag, folded inside its envelope, sealed with the civil registry's embossed stamp. She did not take it out. She had already read it. She already knew what it said. The lobby clock was analog, mounted above the concierge desk, a wide brass face with Roman numerals that Magdalena had selected herself, according to Hector, in 1987. Renata watched the minute hand cross the 11, then the 12. The new year arrived in the Aurelian lobby in near silence. A couple by the elevator kissed briefly. A bellman straightened a luggage cart. 39 floors above, there were likely fireworks visible from the ballroom's east windows, and Rodrigo was likely standing in front of them, golden in the light, his hand at the small of Catalina's back, or perhaps raised in a toast. And Beatrice was likely watching him with the specific satisfaction of a woman who has decided her son's success is the only proof she ever needed. Renata watched the clock. She was not angry. She was not sad. She was something she did not yet have a word for, a quality of stillness she had not felt since before the marriage, before the promotions, before the years of small corrections and smaller recognitions. She sat inside it carefully, the way you sit inside something fragile, not wanting to disturb it before you fully understand what it is. The minute hand completed its turn. The second hand swept forward. She was still sitting there when the party above her reached its loudest, and she was still sitting there when it began, slowly, to quiet. But to understand why that midnight mattered, why that lobby, that clock, that particular woman in that particular gown, we need to go back. Not months. Years. We need to go back to where Magdalena began. Magdalena Solis was not a woman who announced herself. She had grown up the daughter of a seamstress in the Barrio Viejo district of San Cristobal, in a 2-room apartment above a fabric shop. And she had understood from a very young age that the women who lasted were not the women who made noise. They were the women who noticed things, who remembered the names of the men who controlled the zoning boards and the construction permits and the city's slow appetite for development, who showed up early and stayed late and never confused the room's attention for the room's respect. In 1971, she inherited a vacant lot on Avenida Castellana from a distant uncle who died owing her mother 3 years of unpaid tailoring work. The lot was worth, at the time, approximately 4,000 pesos. Magdalena spent 6 months studying the city's development projections, 3 months negotiating a construction loan from Banco Meridional, and 4 years building what would become the Aurelian Hotel, 1 floor at a time, 1 lease at a time, 1 quiet, undramatic decision at a time. She never took on a partner. She never sought a profile. When journalists asked about the building, she directed them to the architecture. She did not consider this modesty. She considered it precision. By 1989, when Solis Family Holdings was formally incorporated under the advisement of her attorney, a then 31-year-old Sofia Reyes Banco, the Aurelian had grown to 26 floors and was generating $4.2 million annually in lease revenue. By 2003, it was 42 floors. By the time Magdalena died at 89, the trust's total assets were valued at $63 million. She had mentioned none of this to the extended family. She had mentioned none of it to Renata's mother. She had mentioned it only to Sofia, who had spent 22 years maintaining the legal architecture that kept it invisible, and to Renata, once, indirectly, in the last summer of her life, when Renata had driven her to a chemotherapy appointment and held her hand in the waiting room and asked her gently if she was afraid. Magdalena had looked at her for a long moment. Then she had said, "Only of leaving things unfinished. And I haven't." Renata had not known what she meant. She would understand later. The estate reading took place in Sofia's offices on Calle Veracruz on a gray Thursday in September, 18 months before the lobby clock struck midnight on New Year's Eve. The extended family sat in the anteroom and was informed, through a sealed summary letter, that the estate had been distributed according to Magdalena's wishes, and that the primary assets had been designated to a named beneficiary. There were objections. There were phone calls. There were 2 weeks of messages that Renata did not return, not because she was hostile, but because Sofia had advised her that silence was, in this circumstance, the legally appropriate response. Renata sat alone in Sofia's office with a folder she had not yet opened and a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Sofia gave her 20 minutes and closed the door. The folder contained the deed to the Aurelian Hotel. It contained the trust documentation for Solis Family Holdings, 34 years of audited accounts, and a prenuptial property disclosure that Renata had signed the week before her wedding, at Magdalena's quiet insistence through a separate attorney in a meeting Rodrigo was not invited to attend. At the time, Renata had not understood the specificity of what she was signing. She had understood only that her grandmother was meticulous and that she trusted her grandmother completely. At the bottom of the folder, written on a single sheet of Magdalena's personal stationery in her compressed, deliberate hand, was one line. "What I leave you cannot be argued with. Only discovered." Renata read it 3 times. She held it for a long while. She did not yet understand it fully, not the way she would understand it later, sitting in a hotel lobby at midnight, listening to her husband's voice drifting down from 39 floors above her. For now it was beautiful and slightly opaque, the way her grandmother's pronouncements had always been, arrived before their meaning, like a letter that makes sense only after the event it was written about has passed. She folded it carefully and placed it in the inside pocket of her coat. It sat against her chest the whole drive home. This is where the irony sharpens, for those of you listening, because 3 years before this September afternoon, Rodrigo's firm had submitted the initial Cerro Blanco Cultural Center permit application to the San Cristobal Urban Planning Office. And buried in that application, in Appendix D of the Land Use Impact Assessment, was a covenant reference, a notation that the Cerro Blanco site's eastern access easement was tied, through a 1987 municipal agreement, to the ownership of the Aurelian Hotel at 14 Avenida Castellana. The covenant required the hotel's owner of record to co-consent any development affecting that easement. Rodrigo's legal team had noted the covenant, confirmed the hotel's ownership as a private trust, and filed the application. No one had contacted the trust's beneficiary. No one had thought to ask who that beneficiary was. She was sitting in the car outside the house on Camino Real when this would later occur to her. Not that evening. That evening she simply sat in the driveway for a few minutes, with her hands on the wheel and the folder on the passenger seat, thinking about her grandmother in a waiting room holding her hand, and saying only that she hadn't left anything unfinished. Then she went inside. She made dinner, she set the table, she said nothing. She did not yet know that the house she was cooking in also belonged to her. That chapter was still in the folder. The early marriage had been warm. That is the part that costs the most to remember. Rodrigo in those first years was a man who called her from job sites just to say he had seen a building she would appreciate. A man who kept a running list of restaurants she had mentioned wanting to try. A man who introduced her at his firm's modest early gatherings as, "My wife, Renata, she knows more about urban planning than anyone in this city, which means she knows more than me." He had said it with genuine admiration. She had touched his arm and deflected the compliment, and believed in the uncomplicated way of someone who has not yet been given reason to doubt that this was simply what they were. Two people who made each other more. The first promotion changed the temperature so slightly that she almost didn't notice. He made partner at Vega and Mora in the spring of the 7th year of their marriage, and the celebration dinner was at Restaurante Atico on Calle Monterrey. And Renata wore a dress she had bought specifically for the occasion and sat beside him and felt genuinely happy. It was only in the car on the way home, Isabel asleep in the back seat, Camilla not yet born, that he said, looking at the road, "You told that story about the Valencia project 3 times tonight. People noticed that." She had not told it 3 times. She had told it once. But she turned toward the window and said nothing, because Isabel was sleeping, and the night had been good, and she did not want to break it. She filed it away in the back of a drawer she was not yet aware she was keeping. The second promotion came 18 months later. Senior partner. His name added to the firm's letterhead in a heavier font, and with it arrived a new vocabulary, precise, reasonable sounding, and delivered always in the car or in the kitchen, never in company. "I just think you talk too much when you're nervous." That wasn't really the moment for a personal story. "You embarrass me without even trying, Renata. I don't know how you don't see it." Each sentence was a small recalibration. Each one arrived before she had fully processed the last. She began touching her collarbone in conversation, a new habit, unconscious, pausing before she spoke, to calculate whether what she was about to say would later require a correction. Then something changed that she could not touch or name directly. Beatrice had always been present in their lives, arriving at Camino Real with the frequency of a seasonal inspection, organized, opinionated, loyal to her son, in the specific, distorting way of women who have built their identity on their children's success. In the early years, Renata had managed her with the easy diplomacy of someone trained to read rooms. She had brought Beatrice coffee she actually liked, remembered her preferences, asked after her friends by name. Beatrice had tolerated this warmth without quite returning it, and Renata had told herself that was simply her manner. After the senior partnership, Beatrice began arriving unannounced. The comment came at the firm's summer dinner at the Terrace Club on Avenida del Puerto. 30 people at the table. Renata had been speaking with a city council member's wife, a conversation she was navigating with the particular skill she had developed over years of these dinners, knowing which questions opened people and which closed them, knowing when to listen and when to redirect. She had not seen Beatrice approach. "She's decorative," Beatrice said to the woman beside her, in the tone of someone offering a neutral and obvious observation. "That's her gift. Not everyone can be useful, and there's no shame in it." The table did not go fully silent, but the small corner of it that mattered did. Renata looked at Rodrigo. He was looking at his wine. He did not correct his mother. He did not look up. And in that specific absence, that carefully maintained distance between a man and a moment he has chosen not to occupy, Renata understood something she could not have articulated then and would only name much later. That he agreed with her. Or that he was willing at minimum to let her believe he did. Which, in the end, is the same thing. She finished her dinner. She thanked the host. She helped stack the dessert plates without being asked. She did not mention it in the car. It was around this time that Catalina Reyes began appearing at firm events. She was Rodrigo's new project director, 34, quick-moving, with the particular confidence of someone who had learned early that certainty, regardless of its basis, commands a room. Renata noticed her the way you notice a change in barometric pressure, not as a specific thing, but as a condition. Rodrigo did not light up around her. He simply became more present in a way that made him less present everywhere else. His evenings at the office lengthened. His attention at dinner narrowed to his phone. When Renata spoke, he heard the shape of the sentence rather than its content. She made an appointment with a therapist named Dr. Carmen Villalba, whose office was on Calle Fuentes, and she canceled it 2 days later. She was not sure what she would say. She was not sure there was anything to say. She redoubled her effort at the firm's spring event, arriving early, circulating deliberately, learning 4 new names and remembering to use them. She organized the council dinners that autumn. 3 of them, held at Camino Real over 6 weeks. The furniture rearranged, extra chairs rented, a caterer she had used before, a florist she trusted. She managed the invitations, and the seating, and the conversation, steering City Councilman Arturo Medina toward Rodrigo at precisely the right moment. Twice, with the invisible grace of someone who has learned to do important work without appearing to do anything at all. Rodrigo thanked each council member at the end of every evening. He thanked the caterer. He shook the florist's hand. He did not thank Renata. The receipt was in the pocket of his gray trousers, which she found in the laundry on a Tuesday in November, doing what she always did on Tuesdays. Hotel Mirabel. 2 nights. The dates corresponded to a conference in Villanueva that Rodrigo had told her he was attending alone. She stood at the laundry machine for a long time. Her hands were still. The house was quiet. Isabel at school, Camilla at her afternoon program, the hum of the dryer, the only sound. She looked at the receipt and did the small, quiet math that a woman does when she has spent months not looking for something and has finally found it without trying. She did not call him. She did not take a photograph. She did not show anyone. She folded the receipt. She found an envelope in the kitchen drawer. She sealed it. She carried it to Magdalena's old writing desk in the study, the one with the locked lower drawer that she had the key to, and Rodrigo did not. and she placed it inside. Then she went back to the laundry. She finished folding his shirts. The envelope would stay in that drawer until the moving company came in January, and it would not matter by then. Not because Renata had forgiven him, but because she had a folder in Sofia Reyes Banco's filing cabinet that made the receipt entirely beside the point. The affair was the wound. What Magdalena left her was the foundation. And foundations don't argue. They simply hold. The envelope was still in the drawer when the last chapter of the marriage began writing itself. It started quietly, the way all of Rodrigo's maneuvers started, framed as practicality, delivered as logic. In June, 7 months before New Year's Eve, he mentioned over breakfast that he was reorganizing the household accounts. Administrative simplification, he called it. The joint account that Renata had used for groceries, the girls' school supplies, her own incidentals, would be consolidated under his primary business account for tax efficiency. He had already spoken to their accountant. She would have a secondary card for household necessities, with a monthly ceiling of 800 pesos. For anything above that, she should send him the receipt, and he would transfer the funds. He said all of this while reading his phone. He did not look up. Renata's hands were around her coffee cup. She kept them there. She said, "All right," because she had learned, by then, that questions about his decisions were received as challenges to his authority, and challenges required corrections, and she was too tired that morning for a correction. What he did not know, what he could not have known, because he had never once thought to ask, was that Renata Elena Solis had a personal account at Banco Meridional, in her birth name, established before the marriage, funded by a modest annual distribution from Solis Family Holdings that Sofia had quietly maintained for 17 years. She had never touched it. She had almost forgotten it existed. It contained, as of the previous quarter, $214,000. She did not mention this. She sent him receipts when she needed to. She learned to need less. Then something shifted that autumn, and it had nothing to do with money. Renata's foot had been aching since October, a low, persistent throb along the outer edge that she had attributed to the new shoes she'd bought for the firm's annual gala, then to the standing required by the third council dinner, then to nothing in particular, which was the category she had developed for pains she didn't have time to investigate. She finally went to Dr. Mateo Arriaga at Clínica del Puerto in early December, more because Isabel had noticed her limping than because she had decided to take herself seriously. Dr. Arriaga ordered an X-ray. The X-ray showed a hairline fracture in the 5th metatarsal, consistent, he said gently, with prolonged stress on an insufficiently rested body. He gave her a structured boot and a referral for a 3-day monitoring stay. She called Rodrigo from the clinic parking lot. He said, "Can it wait until after the New Year's event? The timing is terrible." She said it couldn't. He came to the hospital on the 2nd morning, a Tuesday. He stayed for 22 minutes. She knew because she watched the clock on the wall above the door. He stood rather than sat, which meant he was not planning to stay. He asked how she was feeling. He did not wait for a complete answer before he mentioned that the catering confirmation for the party still needed her to call the florist, that Isabel's school had sent a permission slip he'd left on the kitchen counter, and that the New Year's event was going to be very important for the firm's trajectory. And she should make every effort to be presentable if she was discharged in time. He left. The door swung closed behind him. The nurse, Angela Morris, came in to check Renata's blood pressure and asked, in the careful way of someone who has learned to read rooms, if there was anything she needed. "No," Renata said. "Thank you." She picked up her phone. There was a notification from the firm's social media account, a photograph posted the previous evening, time-stamped 9:47 p.m. The caption read, "Team dinner at Azul rooftop to toast the final Cerro Blanco design submission." In the photograph, 12 people stood around a long table. Rodrigo was at the center. To his left, close enough that their shoulders touched, was Catalina Reyes. She was looking at the camera. Rodrigo was looking at her. He had told Renata the team dinner had been canceled. She set the phone face down on the hospital blanket. Her chest tightened. Not a gasp, not a collapse, but a slow structural pressure, the kind that builds rather than breaks. She looked at the ceiling for a long time. Then she looked at her hands, which were folded in her lap with a stillness she recognized as something new, something that had been forming for months without her permission, settling into place the way sediment settles. Quietly, completely, permanently. She was discharged on December 31st. She dressed in Magdalena's black gown, the one she had collected from the house on the hill 3 weeks earlier, for reasons she hadn't examined too carefully, only knowing she wanted it near. She fastened the pearl earrings. She called a rideshare. She put the estate document in her bag, where it had been sitting since December 29th, tucked against the lining in its civil registry envelope. She did not check whether Rodrigo was home. She simply left. In the car, somewhere on Avenida Castellana, her phone lit up. She read the message once. She did not read it twice. "Stay home, Renata. You always ruin things." She reached into her bag. Her fingers found the envelope, the firm rectangle of it, the embossed stamp of the civil registry, the weight of what was inside. She pressed her palm against it and held it there for a moment, the way you press your hand to something solid when the ground beneath you has been shifting for a very long time. Then she put the phone face down. She looked out the window at the Aurelian Hotel, lit gold against the December sky. She told the driver to keep going. The decision, it should be said, had already been made. Not in the rideshare, not in the hospital, not even in the moment she found the photograph on her phone. It had been made 2 days earlier, alone in a quiet office on Calle Veracruz, in front of a folder she finally allowed herself to fully open. What happened in the rideshare was simply the last page of a chapter she had already finished writing. Chapter 5 is where that decision was born. 2 days before New Year's Eve, the story rewinds. December 29th. The offices of Reyes Banco Legal on Calle Veracruz, 3rd floor. A room with tall windows and afternoon light that arrived at an angle and made everything look slightly more consequential than it was. Sophia had cleared her afternoon. She had not said so explicitly. She had simply confirmed the appointment time and mentioned without elaboration that there was no need to rush. Renata arrived in the clothes she had worn to the grocery store that morning. Jeans, a dark sweater. Her foot was aching in the way it always ached by midday now, the structured boot heavy against the floor as she settled into the chair across from Sophia's desk. She had brought nothing with her. No notebook, no questions written out in advance. She did not know, sitting down, what she was about to become by the time she stood up again. Sophia placed the estate folder on the desk without ceremony and slid it across. This was the second time Renata had seen it. The first had been in September, the immediate aftermath of the estate reading, the shock of it still too large to fully inhabit. She had read the documents then as facts, numbers, property codes, trust vehicles, information she needed to process and then store somewhere safe, the way you store a document you don't yet know how to use. She had taken Magdalena's letter from the bottom of the folder, folded it into her coat pocket, and driven home to a life that had continued unchanged around her. Now she opened the folder again. The deed, the trust structure, the prenuptial disclosure. The Cerro Blanco covenant, flagged in yellow, clause 7, subsection C, She read them in order. She took her time. The afternoon light moved across the desk as she read, and Sophia did not speak, and the office held the particular silence of a room where important things have been decided and are now being decided again. At the bottom of the folder, the letter. She unfolded it carefully. Magdalena's handwriting, compressed and deliberate, the lines slightly uneven in the way of a woman who wrote with intention rather than haste. What I leave you cannot be argued with. Only discovered. The first time she had read it, it had felt like poetry, beautiful and slightly remote, the kind of wisdom that gestures at meaning without quite arriving at it. A grandmother's aphorism, a parting gift of philosophy alongside the practical gifts of deeds and trust documents. The second time, sitting in Sophia's office on December 29th with everything she now knew arranged in front of her, she understood it entirely. Magdalena had not left her a hotel. She had left her a position. She had left her something that could not be dismissed, reframed, diminished, or corrected in a car on the way home. Something that existed in registered documents and civil registry stamps and 42 floors of physical, undeniable stone. Something that did not require Renata to raise her voice or produce a receipt or convince a single person of her worth. It only required her to allow the truth to be visible. She sat with this understanding for a long time. The afternoon light completed its crossing. What settled in her was not calculation. This needs to be said clearly, because it would be easy to mistake what happened in that room for something strategic. A woman seeing an opportunity and taking it. But that is not what it was. What moved through Renata in Sophia's office was something older and quieter than strategy. It was the specific exhaustion of a woman who has spent 17 years absorbing what was never hers to carry, and who has finally, in one clear moment, understood that she can set it down. Not to harm him. Not to humiliate him. Simply to stop standing between Rodrigo and the truth of what he has built his career upon. She had been protecting him without knowing it. She could stop. She closed the folder. She looked at Sophia. "I need 3 things," she said. Sophia opened her notepad. "Notify the hotel's general manager that I am the owner of record and request a meeting at my convenience. File the permit review with the city permitting office. Formal notice that the land use covenant is under ownership review and that no consent will be issued pending that review." She paused. "And prepare the Camino Real title documentation. I want the full ownership history on record and available." Sophia wrote. She did not ask why. She did not offer reassurance or commentary. When she finished writing, she looked up and said, "Are you certain?" "Yes," Renata said. One word. No collarbone. No pause to calculate what was safe. Simply yes, and the weight of it landing not as a decision made in anger or grief, but as a decision made in the specific clarity that comes when you have finally stopped arguing with yourself. She stood. She picked up her coat. She left the folder with Sophia, except for Magdalena's letter, which she refolded and placed back inside her pocket. The same coat, the same pocket, where it had lived since September. Where it had been sitting against her chest for months, waiting. The drive home took 20 minutes. She did not turn on the radio. She thought about her daughters, Isabel's quiet perceptiveness, Camilla's still open warmth, the specific quality of their breathing asleep down the hall, which she had listened to in the dark on bad nights for years, because it was the truest proof she had that she had done at least one irreversible, unambiguously good thing. She thought about what she was going to need to pack. She made dinner that evening. Chicken and rice, which Camilla preferred. She set the table. She listened to Rodrigo talk about the New Year's party, the projection setup, the catering, the seating arrangement for the major clients. And she answered when addressed and passed the bread, when asked and noticed for the first time that she was not bracing. The tension she had carried in her shoulders for so long, she had stopped feeling it, as tension was simply gone. After dinner, she washed the dishes. She dried her hands. She went upstairs to the room where the girls kept their school bags, and she found a single canvas carryall on the shelf above the coats, and she began, quietly, without urgency, one drawer at a time, to fill it. Not with everything, only with what was hers. Everything set in motion in that office on Calle Veracruz was now moving. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the particular unstoppable momentum of a truth that has finally been allowed to travel at its own speed. January 7th was 8 days away, and it was already inevitable. The offices of Reyes Banco Legal occupied the third floor of a building on Calle Veracruz that had no signage on the street and no reception desk visible from the elevator. Sophia had designed it that way deliberately. The people who came here already knew where they were going. They did not need to be announced. Renata arrived at 9:47 a.m. She wore dark trousers, a cream blouse, and the structured boot on her left foot, which still ached with the dull, persistent throb that had become, over the past weeks, simply the texture of her mornings. Magdalena's pearl earrings were in her ears. She had put them in without thinking, the way you reach for something that has always belonged to you. She sat at the head of the conference table, not the side, not the middle, the head, and she placed her single folder in front of her and folded her hands on top of it, and waited. Sophia sat to her right. She said nothing. She did not need to. Rodrigo arrived at 10:04 with 2 partners from the firm, Marco Delgado, the senior equity partner, and Javier Ochoa, who handled client relations, and a man Renata did not recognize who carried a briefcase and the careful expression of a hired attorney who has been given incomplete information about the room he is walking into. They came through the door in a formation that communicated, without words, that they expected to be the most important people present. Rodrigo saw Renata at the head of the table and stopped walking. It was not a dramatic stop. It was the stop of a man whose mental map of the situation has just been quietly revised. A fractional pause, a recalibration behind the eyes, a moment of genuine confusion that he recovered from quickly because he had spent 20 years in rooms where recovery was required. He took his seat across from her. His attorney sat beside him. The partners arranged themselves. Rodrigo's expression settled into the one Renata knew well. Composed, measured, waiting to manage. He did not greet her. She did not greet him. Sophia opened her portfolio and spoke first, in the unhurried cadence of someone who has prepared for this conversation for a very long time. Thank you all for coming. For the record, this meeting has been convened to address matters related to the estate of Magdalena Solis and its implications for several parties present. She paused. I'll begin by introducing my client formally. Seated to my left is Renata Elena Solis, not Renata Solis Vega, not Mrs. Rodrigo Solis Vega, but Renata Elena Solis, which is the name under which all relevant legal instruments are registered, who is the sole beneficiary of Solis Family Holdings and the owner of record of the Aurelian Hotel at 14 Avenida Castellana, as of December 28th of this year. The room did not go silent, but the quality of its sound changed. Marco Delgado looked at Javier Ochoa, a single glance, the kind that carries an entire conversation in the space of a second. Rodrigo's attorney opened his briefcase. Rodrigo himself said nothing. He was looking at Renata with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not contempt, but something that was working its way toward recognition, the slow, reluctant opening of a door he had not known was closed. Sophia placed the first document on the table. The deed. 42 floors, 14 Avenida Castellana, registered to Renata Elena Solis, Solis Family Holdings Trust Vehicle, civil registry stamp dated December 28th. She slid it toward the center of the table and let it sit there. No one touched it immediately. They all looked at it. That was enough. The trust, Sophia continued, was established in 1989 and has been in continuous operation since that time. Its assets are legally designated as separate property under the prenuptial agreement signed by both parties on March 14th, 17 years ago. Mr. Solis Vega signed that document. A copy is included in your packet. Rodrigo's attorney found the page. He read it. The color did not drain from his face. It was more subtle than that. But something behind it shifted. Some internal structure quietly revising itself. The specific matter requiring your attention today, Sophia said, is the Cerro Blanco Land Use Covenant, Appendix D, Clause 7, Subsection C of the permit application submitted to the San Cristobal Urban Planning Office. She placed the highlighted copy on the table beside the deed. The covenant requires written consent from the Aurelian's owner of record before any development affecting the eastern access easement can proceed. As of December 28th, that consent must come from Ms. Solis. It has not been requested. It has not been given. Marco Delgado leaned forward. His voice was careful and professionally neutral, which meant he already understood. The permit review, the notice from the permitting office on January 4th, was initiated at Ms. Solis's instruction, Sophia said. Yes. A silence settled then. A real one. Javier Ochoa set his pen down. He did not pick it up again. Rodrigo spoke for the first time. His voice was controlled, but the control was visible, which meant it was costing him something. Renata. Just her name. A question inside it, though he had not formed the question yet. Sophia spoke before Renata needed to. If you have requests regarding the permit consent, those should be directed to this office in writing. Ms. Solis is not here to negotiate this morning. She is here to ensure that the record is accurate. Sophia placed the second document on the table. The Camino Real title. Registered to Solis Family Holdings. Purchased March 2003. Rodrigo's name appeared nowhere on the page, not as buyer, not as co-owner, not as a note in the margins. He had lived in that house for 14 years. His daughters had grown up in its rooms. His name had never been on the deed. Marco Delgado read it twice. He sat back in his chair slowly, in the way of a man doing very rapid mathematics and arriving at a number he does not like. Rodrigo stared at the title page for a long time. His hands were flat on the table, entirely still, which Renata recognized as the physical posture of a man who has lost the room and knows it. I'd like a moment, he said quietly, to speak with my wife privately. Ms. Solis is not available for a private conversation at this time, Sophia said. The sentence was 8 words and contained nothing extraneous. One of the partners, Javier, gathered his papers. He stood. He excused himself without explanation. The door opened and closed behind him. The remaining attorney began writing something in his notepad that he did not share with anyone. Marco Delgado looked at Renata directly, for the first time in the meeting, with the particular focus of a man who has just recatalogued everyone in the room. We weren't aware, he said carefully, that Mrs. Solis had an interest in the property. Renata looked at him. She had not spoken once in the preceding 40 minutes. She did not raise her voice now. She did not need to. She's been the owner for 22 years, she said. You simply never asked. The room held that sentence for a moment without moving. Then Renata closed her folder. She looked at Sophia, who gave a small, composed nod. Renata gathered the folder from the table, stood, her boot firm against the floor, her full hips and shoulders steady, her back straight in a way that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with finally being exactly where she was supposed to be. And she thanked Sophia in a voice that was quiet and complete. She walked to the door. She did not look back at Rodrigo. She did not need to see his face to know what was on it. She had already seen it. That fractional pause in the doorway, the recalibration, the recognition arriving too late in a man who had spent 17 years not paying attention. She had seen it, and she had let it go. The way you set down something heavy that you have been carrying for so long, you forgot you were carrying it. The door closed softly behind her. The consequences were already in motion. They did not require her presence to continue. The world Rodrigo had built did not collapse dramatically. It receded, the way tide recedes, not with noise, but with a persistent, irreversible withdrawal that left everything behind it exposed. On January 9th, 2 days after the meeting at Reyes Banco Legal, Grupo Alvarado, the anchor client whose $4.8 million commitment had been the financial backbone of the Cerro Blanco Cultural Center, sent a formal withdrawal letter to Vega and Mora, citing, in the measured language of lawyers paid to be careful, unresolved uncertainties in the project's foundational legal documentation. They did not name Renata. They did not need to. The partners knew precisely which document had not been signed and precisely whose name was on it. Catalina Reyes cleared her office on January 14th. The Edinburgh transfer had been announced internally as a professional development opportunity, which was the language firms used when they needed someone gone and preferred not to explain why. She had assured Grupo Alvarado, on 3 separate occasions, that the permits were secured. She had been certain. She had been wrong in the specific, catastrophic way of someone who built confidence on a foundation they never verified. Her plants went into a box. Her awards went into a box. She took the elevator down alone and did not say goodbye to anyone on Rodrigo's floor. The San Cristobal Architecture Press covered Vega and Mora's restructuring in a single paragraph in their February Industry Digest, describing it as a significant recalibration following the withdrawal of the Cerro Blanco Commission. The word recalibration was doing considerable work in that sentence, and everyone who read it understood exactly how much. Beatriz called Rodrigo's number 4 times in the week after the meeting. She called Renata's number twice. Renata's phone registered the calls and offered no response. Beatrice was not a woman accustomed to being answered with silence, and she experienced it not as the consequence of anything she had done, but as an inexplicable withdrawal of something she was owed. She would spend a long time waiting for an explanation that never came. Rodrigo came to the door of the house on Camino Real on January 11th, and again on January 15th. Both times the locks had been changed, and a laminated notice from Solis Family Holdings was affixed beside the bell. He stood on the front step for several minutes each visit, in the particular stillness of a man who has arrived somewhere expecting to be let in, and has found, for the first time, that entry is no longer his to assume. He texted, he called, he wrote a letter, 3 pages, in the careful handwriting of a man who has decided that if he finds the right words he can still manage the room. The letter was forwarded to Magdalena's house on the hill. It arrived on a Tuesday. Renata read it at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold beside her. He wrote about the girls. He wrote about the early years, the restaurant lists, the job sites, the warmth that had been real before it wasn't. He wrote that he understood now what he had not understood then. The letter was not dishonest. Parts of it were even true. She read it to the end, and then set it on the table and sat with it for a moment, not with anger, not with grief, but with the particular quiet of a woman who has already made her peace with a version of events and does not need to revise it. She placed the letter in the kitchen drawer. She did not respond. It was not cruelty. It was completion. The scene settled into something quieter then. Late January. Pre-dawn, the hour before the harbor lights begin to compete with the sky. The house on the hill was still in the way of old houses, not silent, but settled, full of the particular sounds of a structure that has been inhabited with intention for decades. The bougainvillea over the gate rustled in the coastal wind. Down the hall, Isabel and Camilla were asleep, their breathing audible through the open door in the specific rhythm that Renata had catalogued unconsciously over 14 years of standing in hallways on bad nights, needing proof of something good. Sophia had filed the separation papers on January 12th. The Camino Real house was listed for sale on January 18th. The Aurelians' new management structure, a small executive board reporting to Renata through Sophia's office, had held its first operational meeting on January 21st. The land use agreement was being rewritten on terms that named Renata Elena Solis plainly, permanently, and without euphemism in every relevant clause. She sat by the window with her foot elevated on the low chair she had pulled from the hallway, the boot finally removed for the night, her left foot tender and healing in the gradual, undramatic way of things that have been given time and rest. The harbor was dark below, studded with the moving lights of early cargo vessels making their quiet passage. She had loved this view since she was a child. She had not understood, as a child, that she would one day live inside it. In her hand, the clay figure. She had carried it in her coat pocket since September. She had held it in the hospital. She had pressed her palm against it in the ride share on New Year's Eve without taking it out, simply knowing it was there. Now she held it openly in the light from the window and looked at it properly for the first time in a long while. A woman no larger than a hand, arms open, slightly uneven from 60 years of being held. The clay worn smooth at the shoulders where Magdalena's fingers had rested. A memory surfaced, quiet and complete. What I leave you cannot be argued with, only discovered, the first time she had read it as philosophy, the second time as anchor. Now, holding the clay woman in the pre-dawn dark above the harbor, she understood it as something simpler and more total than either of those. It was a description of Renata herself. What Magdalena had seen in her granddaughter, the specific, unperforming competence, the steadiness, the worth that existed entirely independent of whether anyone in the room was paying attention, was not something she had tried to argue for. It had simply been there, waiting to be found, by the right person, at the right moment. Even if that person turned out to be Renata herself. This is the thing about real power. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't require an audience or a performance or a room full of people who are finally forced to look. It simply exists quietly in documents and deeds and the accumulated decisions of women who built things carefully and said very little and trusted that the right people would discover what they left behind. Rodrigo had spent 17 years in a house that was never his, in a building that was never his, building a career on a foundation whose owner he had never once thought to ask about. He had looked at Renata and seen furniture. He had confused her stillness for emptiness because the alternative, that her stillness was the stillness of someone who had nothing to prove, was a thought that would have required him to sit very quietly with himself. And that was the one thing he had never been able to do. She did not think about him for long. He was already becoming the past, and the past had the decency to stay where it was put. Before you go, if this story found you tonight, if some part of it sat close to something you've been carrying, Leave it in the comments. Tell me the moment that landed hardest. And tell me where in the world you're listening from, because these stories travel farther than I ever expect. And I want to know who's on the other end. Renata set the clay figure on the windowsill. She looked at it for a moment. The small, open-armed woman her grandmother had kept on her desk for 60 years, watching over every quiet decision that had made this moment possible. Then she looked out at the harbor, and the lights on the water, and the sky beginning, very slowly, at its farthest eastern edge, to change. Her daughters were breathing down the hall. The new year was entirely hers. She had not gone home that night in December. She had not gone home since. And the reason was not anger, and it was not defiance, and it was not even grief. The reason was that she had finally understood where home actually was. It was here. It had always been here, waiting to be discovered.